Hello, welcome to this episode of Lasting Transformation. I'm Alun Parry and I'm the author of How to Remove Trauma Response, a Memory Reconsolidation guidebook for therapists and coaches. And what I want to do in this episode is something a little bit different. I want to look at the reasons why people will decide to really give some time and attention to personal development and personal growth. Because most people think that things like coaching or therapy is for those times when life falls apart, but actually there are other important reasons. And I want to talk about one that's often overlooked today, and that is the sense of the psychological demands that come from a life that is expanding. So what I want to look at today are three things, really. I want to look at the reasons why people decide to give some time and attention to personal development, and crucially, the one that gets missed. Secondly, I want to look at what happens when life expands and why that might be a good time, even maybe the best time, to think about personal development. And finally, I want to look at the internal ceiling that can actually cap our external growth. Even if we're really skilled and powerful in the external world, how some of the internal limits can ensure that we don't get the most out of that. And so let's look at the first one of those things. It's the reason really why people decide to go and receive coaching or get support from therapy or whatever it happens to be, paying attention really to our own personal development. Because one of the things that people assume, that when someone goes to coaching or therapy or getting that level of personal development support, it's because life is in crisis. And that is a good reason to pay some attention. Like if you're really stuck and things are a real struggle or life is in crisis, then that's a great reason, isn't it, to get some support with that. And it's a really common way that people will think about personal development support, but it's only one of the ways. Another of the reasons why people will decide to get some support around something, and this has certainly been true in my life, is where you notice that there are some patterns in life that you just no longer want to be carrying forward with you. And so you'll spot those patterns, you'll notice that they're getting in the way. And so you'll go, okay, I'm going to give this some attention and move beyond this. So I'm not carrying this old baggage with me going forward. So that's a second reason why people will seek out some support and spend some time and attention on personal development. But one of the ways that is often missed, like one of the reasons why people do this and get so much benefit from doing this, is not as a result of stuckness, not because life is in crisis, but actually because life is expanding. It's as a result of growth that it becomes necessary to start looking at our own personal development work in order to actually maximize the growth that you're capable of. And it's a really important point, this, because I'm going to give some examples of why that's an important point in a moment. But it's a really important point because it's very easy to miss that personal development is not just for people who feel stuck, who are in crisis, who are struggling, although it's really important for those people too. But it's actually especially important for people who are growing, because when we're growing, what will tend to happen is that we'll start to be placing ourselves in new, different situations. And because we're in new, different situations, what happens is some of that old psychological baggage, if you like, is getting touched upon in a way that it wasn't before the growth. A really silly example, I suppose, and I think this is true of all kinds of change. Change will bring its own sort of psychological demands, and crucially, change will mean sometimes that some old buttons that they existed, but they were never really getting pressed very much, are now getting pressed. So I'm going to give a silly example of this. Let's suppose that a person is really scared of frogs. And so frogs really terrify them. Now, this is a button that they have that's a live button that when pressed, they're terrified. But this person lives in the middle of the city. And so even though they're terrified of frogs, it's a fear that they can keep hold of, because when do they ever really see a frog? When do they ever encounter a frog in the middle of an urban city? They just don't. And so they are scared of frogs, but they can stay scared of frogs because it's just not an issue. And then they move to a rural environment and they're living in this cottage and it's got this lovely little pond. Next thing you know, guess what's in the pond? Frogs. And every day they're encountering these frogs. Now, nothing has changed in terms of their own internal psychological landscape, but their environment has changed. Their world has changed. They've moved from that place to this place. And in this place, that button that was already pre-existing, but was never really pressed, is now being pressed a lot. So this is the case with change anyway. Growth brings about change. And the thing with growth is that as we grow and it brings about change that is beneficial for us, rather than maximizing the benefit, rather than even being in a position to grow even further, some of these psychological buttons and the psychological demands that growth places on us means that we can't optimize that. And so that's what I want to talk about next. I want to talk about what happens when life expands. So we've seen these 3 reasons why people get support, either because life is feeling stuck or in crisis, or the second one is that you're spotting some patterns that you want to be rid of. And the third one, that crucially overlooked one, is because actually you're not stuck, you're growing, and the growth places new psychological demands. So that's what I want to talk about next. So the core dynamic here is that if your life is growing, if your life is expanding, what will happen is that inevitably, almost inevitably, it's going to create certain psychological demands upon you. It's going to put certain psychological demands on you that were not there because you're now in not just a new place, but a bigger place. And then what's it like to be in that bigger place? How do we handle being in that bigger place? How do we handle a bigger version of ourselves? Certainly in terms of the view of the outer world. And it can throw up all sorts of things like imposter syndrome, like fear of visibility. A whole host of things can actually come forth with that growth. So that new place, that'll be asking things of you personally that you might not have been asked before. Or, like the frogs example, it starts to press buttons that were pre-existing but were not being pressed before. So what this looks like in real life is that actually you're not stuck and you're not in crisis. And it's not just that you're noticing patterns that are showing up in your everyday life. It's that life is actually moving forward. This is a result of your capability, of your power, of your potency, your ability to make change in the external world, and things are moving forward. It might be your business, it might be your career, it might be you're entering a new relationship, or your ambitions are growing and you're charting a course forward and life is actually moving forward. But as life expands, not only do the opportunities increase, but so do the internal challenges as well. Some of those internal buttons then start to be getting pushed by the very fact that you're in this new and crucially bigger world. And so just as things start expanding on the outside, that's when you hit this internal ceiling. And when that internal ceiling is there, the life you're stepping into starts to feel bigger than the identity that you grew up with and have brought with you into adult life. And so you get that sense of understanding that the next level that you're going to is simply going to require a bigger version of you. I'm going to give you an example of this from someone pretty famous who's talked quite openly about this challenge. And it's the author and podcaster and investor, Tim Ferriss. So Tim Ferriss has spoken about how he had to grow internally in order to ensure that the external success that he got didn't actually crush him. And it's a really, really good example. Like I say, he's spoken very openly about this. And it's a good example of why we need personal development when we're moving forward and not just when we feel stuck. So what happened in terms of Tim Ferriss's example that he shares is that he had this people-pleasing tendency, a difficulty in saying no. But in ordinary life before his success, sure, life would press upon it sometimes. But once he got success, once he published his book, The 4-Hour Workweek, and that became a massive thing, and Tim Ferriss really exploded into the world, what happened with the success is that he was then getting a lot of requests for his time and attention. Some of them were opportunities, some of them were not opportunities, but were maybe favors, or can you help out with this, or would you give a quote for my book, for the book cover, all these kind of things that then started rushing his way because he'd reached this level of success. And so what he said is that this people-pleasing button that was pressed every now and again before he was successful, because of the growth, because of the success, because his life had expanded, meant that that button now was being pressed over and over and over again. And psychologically, it felt really difficult for him to be able to say no to all these requests, demands, opportunities, and so forth. And so he became inundated with them. And it's a really great example of how somebody has had to take a step and take a pause and go, I really need to look at my own internal personal development in order to be able to handle all of the success that I've created in the outer world. Because it's the very fact that I've become successful that has meant that this button that was hardly ever pressed is now being pressed constantly. And the only way I'm going to be able to deal with this is to look at my personal development and get to a place where I can get some lasting transformation around the difficulty and pain that I feel about saying no. And so it's a great example, that, isn't it, of how someone even super successful like Tim Ferriss has noticed that it's the very fact of his success that has made it necessary to look at his own personal development. Another example, which might be a more typical one, is, let's say, for instance, let's say a person has been working on their career and there's a role that they really wanted and they apply for that role and it's a big promotion and they move forward, their life expands, they've grown in terms of their career ambitions, and now they're in this new role. And what they notice now is that whereas before in their old role, they were kind of under the radar and other people were being very public facing, now that they're in the role that they wanted, this bigger role, and their life has actually expanded, what they notice now is that they have to be more visible. They have to be more public facing. They have to speak to meetings of quite a lot of people. They have to give interviews or they have to talk to teams. And all of a sudden, there's a button being pressed around visibility. Like suddenly they feel really exposed. Now, it was a button that might have been pressed a little bit like Tim Ferriss's occasionally in life before. But as a result of their external success, now this button is being pressed relentlessly. And so they're feeling all of this anxiety because now they're very public facing and very visible. And that places a psychological demand upon them because being visible feels really exposing and not so safe. And so that's another great example whereby we're not needing personal development because we're in crisis. We're not needing personal development in this case because we're stuck. In fact, the very opposite. We need the personal development stuff as a result of the fact that we are moving and moving forward and growing and expanding. And it's the very fact that we're expanding in the outer world which is creating the pressure in our internal world and means that what we're going to have to do is pay attention to our personal development, and so that we can grow in order to be able to be okay with the success and the growth that we've created. So we've looked there, haven't we, at the different reasons why people get personal development. We've looked at some examples of what happens when life expands and new demands appear. And I want to look now just at the ramifications, really, of this sense of us having an internal ceiling that caps our external growth. The sense that there is actually a disconnect between what we're capable of creating out there in the external world and what we're capable of banking, if you like, not in a monetary way necessarily, but we're able to kind of maximize and hold on to the amount of success that we can create. And so the way I think about this is when I'm working with people who are getting my help basically because they're looking at their personal development because they're growing. I have a lot of clients like this. They notice that they have a lot of potency, they have a lot of power, they're smart, they're capable, they can go out into the world and make things happen for themselves. But it hits this internal ceiling quite often. So we can build it out there, but there's a limit here. So you might be the kind of person who knows that you have the potency, you have the ability to expand things in the external world, but you also notice that you're limited by some internal barriers, because we all have internal barriers. We're all humans with psychological limits on ourselves. And so what we find there is that we can only grow as big as that internal ceiling. And so the internal ceiling is typically lower than our ability to create that external growth. And so we fail to maximize what we actually have created. We fail to keep hold of what we've actually created. A bit like that example before, where the person has now got this role, they've got all this visibility suddenly upon them, and then they shrink back. And it's because that's shrinking back, because it's placed that new psychological demand that needs some attention, that they're not able to hold and bank and collect and capture everything that they're capable of achieving in the outside world. So 18 years ago, I set up something which was a social enterprise in the city where I live in Liverpool. And it's quite a large social enterprise. And if you're wondering what social enterprise is, it's basically where you set up something that's a business, but the aim of the business is that you take the profits and you plow it into the community for community projects. So it's kind of like the entrepreneurship is for a social reason, if that makes sense. And so I went through this quite prestigious international school called the School for Social Entrepreneurs. And once I became a fellow of the School for Social Entrepreneurs, I was then asked to mentor and coach the next cohort because I'd been through the process. I'd done and implemented a lot of things for that particular social enterprise. So they asked me, would I help the people who are coming after me? And it reminds me this is probably my gateway to becoming a coach and a therapist in the first place. Because what I noticed here is something that the business writer Matthew Kimberley often talks about, where he says every business problem is a personal development problem that just manifests in a businessy way. And so one example that sticks in my mind is there was this person I was working with, and they had this fantastic social enterprise. They were doing great work, but it was clear that the price they were charging was unsustainable. They couldn't keep this wonderful program alive at the rates that they were charging. Now, when you think about this, and this is a good example really of how one's ability to create something in the outer world is limited by our own internal ceiling. The rate that they were charging just needed to increase, otherwise the whole project would have fallen. Now, the process of increasing the rate, especially for newer customers, not the ones that they already had, but for new people who are coming into the world, it was just an admin task. All they had to do was increase the number. And they found that very, very difficult, because what was coming up there was a whole load of stuff for that person around their own sense of personal value. So like Matthew Kimberley says, that business problem was actually a personal development problem manifested and disguised as a business issue. Because the idea of them charging so much for the thing that they did, that really challenged their own sense of personal value. Like, how dare they be the kind of person who charges that amount for the service, even though the service was brilliant, and even though that rate that they needed to increase it to was necessary to keep the project going. And so you can see it would have been very easy for them to increase the price in an admin sense, in an external world. Their service was definitely top class, so people would have paid that too. But then the internal ceiling, as they were growing externally, they were hitting upon that internal ceiling in such a way that it was the psychological aspect that was becoming the fatal flaw of that enterprise. It wasn't a skill set issue. It wasn't that they lacked the skills and abilities to create something wonderful in the outer world that would be amazing. They were already doing that. It was simply that there was an internal psychological demand that was being placed upon them. And so their task really was a personal development task so that they could grow and expand that internal ceiling in order to allow them to fulfill the fullness of their capabilities. And so the reason why I think this is important, this topic, is essentially because we often think that personal development is for solving a crisis, that personal development is something that is there when we notice there are these terrible patterns getting in our way. But actually, when we grow, that is the best time to look at personal development, because it's almost like, let's say you're carrying a rucksack on your back and you're going on a journey, and along the journey there's all these resources and things that are going to be really useful to you. But if you've only got a small rucksack, even though you've gone on a path that opens up all these resources to you, there's only so much you can carry in such a tiny rucksack. And so what personal development does is it allows you to expand the size of the rucksack so that it can hold all of those things that you're creating in the outside world. If your life is expanding and you can see that the next level requires a bigger version of you, then that's a real signal that it's time really to look at your own personal development so you can maximize all of the potency and skill sets and wonderfulness that you will be able to create in the outer world. So my invite to you, I suppose, is to notice as your own life is expanding, what is the button that is being pressed more often? As you look at the next stage of life, when you think of your ambitions and you place yourself in the future version of you, where the outside world stuff has expanded for you in the way that you want, place yourself in there and notice just inside your body the aspects of that new world that feel a little troubling to you, that feel a little bit scary to you. And that'll give you a clue as to that, where that internal ceiling is, where those live buttons are that might not be getting pressed very often at the moment, but will be getting pressed a lot, and maybe actually even stops you from growing in the way that you want to, because you're aware that there's a fearful scenario that awaits you in terms of pressing those scary buttons. Now, if you're a person who recognizes yourself from what I've said in this podcast, and if you're someone whose life is expanding, or that you're ready to step into that bigger life, then you might be interested in a program that I'm setting up called the Bigger Lives program. And if you go to freshtherapists.com, that's plural, freshtherapists.com/bigger lives, then I'd really like to talk to you. So let's set up a 30-minute clarity call where we can talk about what this vision is that you have and what some of the limits might be going forward. If you want to find out about the work I do more generally, and I'll put that link in the show notes for Bigger Lives, but if you want to find out more generally what I do, then you can go to freshtherapists.com. That's where I help other therapists and coaches be the best versions of themselves and genuinely be able to create lasting transformation. So not management of problems, but actually erasing the problems using the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience. And if you wanted to work one-on-one with me, you can find me at alunparry.com. That's ALUN. And like I say, if the content and the messaging within this particular episode makes you think, yeah, that's exactly where I'm at, then you might be interested in the Bigger Lives program. So go to freshtherapists.com/bigger lives. So let's just have a recap before we finish. We've looked first of all at the various reasons that mean that people decide to put some attention and put some energy into their own personal growth. There's when we're stuck or in crisis. There's when we spot patterns. But what we've talked about today is that third one, which is so often overlooked, that we need personal development because our lives are actually growing and we're experiencing some internal growing pains. We've looked as well about what happens when life expands and those new demands appear and those buttons that pre-existed are now getting pressed, like we saw with the Tim Ferriss example, or with the person who is now more visible because of their new promotion at work. And we've also looked, haven't we, at that internal ceiling that caps our ability for external growth, and how our skills and ability and potency and power in the outside world is normally bigger than what we can carry internally. And so it becomes really necessary then to let that internal ceiling rise so it matches our potency and we don't end up limiting ourselves. So I hope that's been interesting. I hope that's been useful. If you want to find out more about the Bigger Lives program, the link is in the show notes, but it's freshtherapists.com/bigger lives. And I will see you on the next episode.